let's go ahead and jump into chapter 2. Let's do chapter 2, verses 1 through 32. Who can do that for me?
I can do that one. Did you want to talk about the book of whatever?
I'll make a comment about this. So there are several extra biblical texts mentioned in the Bible. Apocryphal works are cited as well. In fact, the book of Enoch, which is an apocryphal New Testament writing, is cited in the New Testament by one of the New Testament authors. Side note, in the Old Testament, there are several extra biblical texts that are cited as sources for some of the work that you're reading here. The book of Jasher is one of them. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the only one in the Old Testament that's mentioned that we still think we know what it is. All of the other ones have been lost to history. Just FYI. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Later, David prayed to the Lord, saying, "Should I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to David, "Go." David answered, "Where should I go?" The Lord answered, "To Hebron." So David went up to Hebron with his two wives, Ahinoam from Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal from Carmel. David also brought his men and their families, and they all made their homes in the cities of Hebron. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron and appointed David king of Judah. They told David that the men of Jabesh Gilead had buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, "The Lord bless you. You have shown loyalty to your master Saul by burying him. May the Lord now be true and loyal to you. I will also treat you well because you have done this. Now be strong and brave. Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have appointed me their king." Abner son of Ner was the commander of Saul's army. Abner took Saul's son Ishbosheth to Mahanaim and made him king of Gilead, Ashuri, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and all of Israel. Saul's son Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he ruled for 2 years. But the people of Judah followed David. David was king in Hebron for 7 years and 6 months. Abner son of Ner and the servants of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men also went there and met Abner and Ishbosheth's men at the pool of Gibeon. Abner's group sat on one side of the pool, and Joab's group sat on the other. Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men have a contest here." Joab said, "Yes, let them have a contest." And then the men got up and were counted, 12 from the people of Benjamin for Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 from David's men. Each man grabbed the one opposite him by the head and stabbed him in the side with a knife. So the men fell down together, and for that reason that place in Gibeon is called the Field of Knives. That day there was a terrible battle, and David's men defeated Abner and the Israelites. Zeruiah's 3 sons, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, were there. Now Asahel was a fast runner, as fast as a deer in the field. Asahel chased Abner, going straight toward him. Abner looked back and said, "Is that you, Asahel?" Asahel said, "Yes, it is." Then Abner said to Asahel, turn to your right or left and catch one of the young men and take his armor." But Asahel refused to stop chasing him. Abner said again to Asahel, "Stop chasing me. If you don't stop, I'll have to kill you. Then I won't be able to face your brother Joab again." But Asahel refused to stop chasing Abner. So using the back end of his spear, Abner stabbed Asahel in the stomach, and the spear came out of his back. Asahel died right there, and everyone stopped when they came to the place where his body lay. But Joab and Abishai continued chasing Abner. As the sun was going down, they arrived at the hill of Ammah near Giah on the way to the desert near Gibeon. The men of Benjamin came to Abner, and all stood together at the top of the hill. Abner shouted to Joab, "Must the sword kill forever? Surely you must know this will only end in sadness. Tell the people to stop chasing their own brothers." Then Joab said, "As surely as God lives, if you had not said anything, the people would have chased their brothers until morning." Then Joab blew a trumpet, and his people stopped chasing the Israelites. They did not fight them anymore. Abner and his men marched all night through the Jordan Valley. They crossed the Jordan River after marching all day and arrived at Mahanaim. After he had stopped chasing Abner, Joab came back and gathered the people together. Asahel and 19 of David's men were missing, but David's men had killed 360 Benjaminites who had followed Abner. David's men took Asahel and buried him in the tomb of his father at Bethlehem. Then Joab and his men marched all night. The sun came up as they reached Hebron.
This is free, and you can read how an exciting story here. What is your reaction to this?
Very bloody. Bloody object lesson.
Yeah. Why?
Like they use the physical brothers chasing each other to say, hey, let's quit fighting amongst us.
Like that. Yep.
Because this could just go on forever.
We have civil war, folks. This is a civil war, whether you want to admit it or not. It breaks out. Why? Because power vacuum, right? Now, it's important to note here, first of all, what do you notice about David in the very beginning of chapter 2? What does he do to know what to do?
Inquired.
He asked God. What a novel thing to do. Now, as soon as this happens, the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. Okay, full stop. Let's review what has just happened here. If you'll remember back to 1 Samuel, you'll recall that God himself, through Samuel, the prophet, anointed David the king over all of God's people, all 12 tribes of Israel. What has happened here is the men themselves are now recognizing that. But it's only the men of Judah. So quick history lesson here. There are 12 tribes of the people of Israel, descendants of Jacob, who inhabit this region that we call Israel. It's also called Palestine, or Canaan. There are 10 tribes of the north that we call Israel, and it's very confusing, but just stay with me. So 10 tribes of the northern kingdom called Israel, and there are 2 tribes in the south called Judah. The men of Judah have recognized David as their king, and that was pretty easy. However, the men of Israel have not. The men of Israel are still clinging to this hope that the descendants of Saul, who is now essentially a puppet of this general, will rule the whole nation, and so civil war breaks out. But it's important to remember that David was already anointed by God himself as the king. This is not a second anointing. This is just kind of a public acknowledgement of that. So, what else did you take from this?
I have a note written down that says, why did David allow this? As in, the other guy was Saul's son, was 4 years old when he reigned for 2 years. It seemed like, obviously David knew he was anointed.
Yep.
But I think he always felt like, I'll do it in God's timing, not my timing. I'll be the king over all of Israel at some point. But maybe David had a side talk with God, and it's not recorded here. But it doesn't say David wondered why. Why does Saul? I mean, David didn't come out and just start telling all of Saul's family members. Normally, when a king dies, everybody gets killed, as we talked about before.
That's it. That's exactly it. Wipe out the competition. I think that's fair. Yeah, it's a good point. That sometimes there's a lot more going on than is actually recorded in the text that we have here. But what you don't see, and to your point, Tim, is David going out and assaulting the opposition. He's actually trying to win their hearts and minds. Look at this. Look at how hard David is working to win the hearts and minds of the people. The people of Jabesh Gilead. Look at he's sweet talking them. He's sweet talking them, right?
What's that caught me off guard? What was the big deal about burying him?
Okay, this is a good one.
You are you're so kind that you buried him.
Rewind, because it gets at this. You may have seen this Zeruiah and been like, wait a minute, record stop. Well, what's going on here? Why is Zeruiah mentioned? Who is that? Who are these 3 dudes? Why is that so important? If you go to 1 Chronicles, 2 verse 13, you'll find out that Zeruiah is David's sister. She is one of the daughters, or it could be a stepdaughter, of Jesse. Well, that means that those 3 dudes are David's nephews. So, again, we have a big family thing going on here, right? So I think this is the connection, and you might miss that if, it's not really explained here. The other thing that you'll find is that if you read this First Chronicles passage, you'll also find that David has another sister named Abigail. Now, before you get all excited about what that means, because he has a wife named Abigail, it's pretty certain that this is not the same woman who is his wife right now. In antiquity, it would happen, and we know from Genesis that it did happen, that sometimes your stepsister or half-sister could become your wife. It does not seem as if that has happened here. Most scholars are pretty sure they just have two people with the same name, just like it happens in the New Testament too. But it's just kind of an interesting connection there. It's also interesting as we start to read forward, because of that connection to David, it starts to make more sense why David isn't wiping those guys out. You know, he keeps them alive. Tries to.
Well, and I think the whole thing of burying Saul really comes down to, you know, what's the most disgraceful way for a body to be
Yeah.
disposed of. You know, let the animals and the birds of the air
Yeah.
pick its flesh. And, you know, Saul's already been defiled by having his head cut
Yeah.
off. So I think that, you know, it was, you know, honoring Saul through what God's plan was for, you know, what the custom of that time was to actually bury a body first, letting the beasts of the fields and the birds of the air feast on it.
Yeah, that's the law. I mean, technically, if we're talking specifically about the burial itself, you had to bury the body. I mean, that was Jewish law of the time. If you followed the Torah, you had to do that. Absolutely right. There's so much going on here. What else do you take from this? Looks like, again, David is outmatching his opponents. If you see here, again, history is written by the victors, but I do believe this is authentic, that David's men, you know, there was only a few of them killed, but there was, 360 of the enemy who were slaughtered. Again, this is God's people, folks. This is a civil war. God's people are killing each other.
Well, it's interesting too that the 12 that they picked from David had knives. It doesn't sound like the ones from Saul, because in Trisha's version it said they were going to have a fist fight. And they brought knives to a fist fight and just stabbed the other ones. So,
Possible.
but, you know, I thought that was
I would say it's always good to caution yourself against the reading and interpretation of the text, because I believe the Hebrew word for dagger is the same as like aggression or something. And so I think you got to be careful, because sometimes it's hard to understand what they were really saying. Were they really daggers, or were they just, you know, the same word can mean three different things, but, you know, someone died,
Yeah.
whether they had a knife or not, right?